In this episode from BMO Equity Research's Metal Matters, BMO Commodities analyst Helen Amos is joined by Ro Dhawan, President and CEO of the ICMM, to discuss how the role of sustainable mining is shifting in a world where mining and critical minerals has been thrust into the foreground of global geopolitics.
Welcome to Markets Plus, where leading experts from across BMO discuss factors shaping the markets, economy, industry sectors, and much more. Visit bmocm.com/Markets Plus for more episodes.
Hello and welcome to this special Metal Matters podcast, where I am joined by Ro Dhawan, President and CEO of the International Council on Mining and Metals, ICMM, which for decades has been at the forefront of driving sustainable development of the global mining industry. We're extremely lucky to have Ro as a repeated guest speaker at BMO's annual Global Metals, Mining and Critical Minerals Conference in Miami, which is now rapidly approaching, as well as also being a returning guest on this podcast. So, Ro, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Helen. And on behalf of all of us, and there are many of us who are fans of BMO, let me welcome you to BMO and say what a brilliant choice BMO has made to bring you on board.
That's very kind of you, Ro. Well, Ro, since we spoke to you a year ago, it feels like the world is a different place. I mean, the geopolitical situation is moving rapidly as we speak. Not only that, but mining and natural resources are quite literally at the center of the power shifts playing out right in front of our eyes. So we've got a huge amount of ground to cover today, and I'm especially excited to hear about all the progress ICMM and its members have been making in sustainable development and all your priorities for the year ahead. But firstly, you've just come back from Davos, a week full of major headlines. And I'd love to hear your impressions, in your own words, of the mood on the ground there and how the position of sustainability generally may be changing in conversations.
Helen, yes, Davos, the place of the haves and the have-yots. I say that only partially in jest because let's be clear, right? It is a place where the elite gather to discuss the state of the world. And as the old adage goes, whatever Davos agrees on, you can bet that the exact opposite is going to happen. Now, in this case, I'm not sure that holds true because I think a number of the themes at Davos are things that we are seeing play out. So, big focus on national security across the board. And of course, we had President Volodymyr Zelensky there from Ukraine talking about why Ukraine security is European security. Of course, you had the US administration talking about the importance of national security vis-a-vis Greenland. And you had everybody concerned about this much more risky world we seem to be entering in, where there's the potential for some serious miscalculation here. We've just upped the ante on everything, and one wrong move could cascade through into a series of pretty unfortunate circumstances. But, Helen, and here's the really interesting thing, the whole theme of dialogue was present at Davos. The idea was, can we find ways to talk to each other even when we may disagree strongly? I don't know if at the end of the week you would say that Davos achieved that, because actually what you ended up with was very different visions painted by different people. Of course, I think the standout speech of Davos was Mark Carney's. But I would say that when it comes to metals and minerals, Helen, there was such a central focus on this sector and its role in all the big thematics: artificial intelligence, defense. And yes, there wasn't that much mention of the energy transition, but I think even though it was unsaid, everybody understood that metals and minerals start and end, at each points of that value chain. So overall, Helen, even though the world is a more complicated and uncertain place, I left Davos feeling pretty certain that the prospects for metals and minerals are very bright because they are now very deeply connected to the big global thematics.
Yeah. I mean, it's incredible times that we're living in, but also incredible to think that now, finally, after many decades, mining is entering mainstream conversations. So, finally, we're an industry that everybody is talking about. Now, Ro, I've obviously been familiar with the great work of ICMM for many years now, especially when I was in industry myself, and as an organization, it carries a huge deal of weight and respect from the mining companies. And I saw that firsthand. So perhaps as a good starting point for our listeners, could you maybe first talk through what you see have been like the major changes and progress areas ICMM and its members have brought about over the last, say, 5 to 10 years?
Absolutely, Helen, and thanks for the kind words. Look, for over 2 decades now, ICMM has existed with one mission and one mission only, which is to improve the level of responsibility in the mining industry collectively, so that at the end of the day, we earn society's trust and support in order to grow our businesses. This isn't charity. This isn't because we're some NGO. It's because we understand that our business success is tied to whether societies see us as a positive contributor environmentally and socially. And so we've sought to show leadership. And when I say we, I mean 26 companies represented at a CEO level in ICMM. We have between us 650 mines in over 50 countries. We're somewhere between a third and a half of the industry by production. So really our sense is that when we show leadership on issues, hopefully that sets the tone for the rest of the industry, improves performance, and thus changes what people think of the industry and know of mining. Now, we've identified 5 topics in particular, Helen, that we think are vital for us to show leadership on. I'll just quickly mention them now. The first is on safety. There is nothing more important than making sure everybody goes home safe at the end of their work shift. Unfortunately, we're not quite there yet. And more worryingly, we've seen a reversal of the trend in the last 2 years, which had been a declining number of fatalities across the ICMM membership. So safety remains our number one priority, closely followed by tailings as a second issue. In previous BMO conferences, we've talked a lot about the tailings work to improve the standards for tailings management in the industry following the tragedy at Brumadinho in Brazil in 2019, which cost 272 lives. And there's been a lot of work both to make sure that the wider industry is adopting the standard for tailings management, and we as an industry are innovating how we mine so that we can mine by producing fewer waste rock. The third topic for us, Helen, that's really important is our work on decarbonizing and making mining vehicles safer, because you can do both at the same time. So while we're innovating on how these large trucks in mining are run and how they're designed, we can both reduce the amount of fuel they consume and therefore the amount of CO2 that's generated, and we can make those trucks safer at the same time. So there's a lot of work happening in that area. The fourth topic is on the issue of nature. And here, Helen, we're an industry that has an impact on nature. There's no question about that. We have a direct footprint on the land and the plants and animals that live in it, the water bodies and the air quality. But this industry has the potential to be an even bigger net positive contributor to nature than we already are. Because although, yes, you have to disturb land to get metals and minerals out, the impact of those metals and minerals in allowing us to live vertically, in allowing humanity to live in cities, means that our net impact on nature is extremely positive. That being said, we need to make sure that where we operate are places where we try and minimize the direct and indirect consequences of our operations as much as possible. And finally, Helen, our work on social performance, because we know that no matter how valuable the minerals are and how much we say to people that these metals are essential to modern life, and of course they are, for a lot of host countries, what they really care about is making sure that human rights will be protected, that there won't be mining just against the wishes of local populations, that there will be benefits flowing back into host countries and communities, that taxes will be paid fairly, that there'll be transparency. And that's something that we've always been committed to. And we want to keep making sure that that progress continues. So those are the 5 areas, Helen, that for us are a major priority at the moment. We'll talk a little bit more later about the work we're doing on making sure this doesn't just remain an ICMM-led initiative, but expands to the wider industry. And all of it feeds into our work to try and change people's understanding and perception of the mining industry based on our better performance, not just based on some PR campaign.
Yeah, I mean that's truly impressive. I mean, there's so many different pillars of change that you're bringing about. You know, safety, emissions, nature, society, and all of these things are not just a nice to have, right? I mean, you have to have them to keep operating as a mining company. Now, maybe one of those areas we could just pause on there, and that's safety. This is a topic that stands out for me, as sadly the past year there have been some major mine accidents. Particularly in copper, actually, is impacting lives and the environment. Now, how has the ICMM and its members responded to this? Because it really does feel like different this time. And has this changed the way you think about safety as a strategic priority? I know you said it as your number one, but how do you balance that with all the other priorities and commitments that you have?
It's the most important commitment by far, Helen. And the last 12 months, as you say, the major accidents we've seen at large copper mines that have tragically claimed so many lives have driven home the point that we cannot be complacent. I say that because, Helen, we've been tracking safety across the ICMM members since 2014, and we publicly disclosed that information based on a company-by-company basis. So from 2014 up until 2022, the trend line had been going down in terms of number of fatalities at ICMM members. And then something changed in 2022, and the line has started to go back up. So in 2022, 33 people went to work at ICMM member companies and didn't come home. 2023, that number was 36. 2024, that number was 42. And 2025 has not been off to a good start. So, Helen, there's something happening here that tells us that the really hard work over many years to try and get a grip on this, we now need to figure out why it's going back in the wrong direction. Now, some other things to be aware of in terms of how those safety numbers manifest, because it might tell us where the issues or the challenges may lie. The first thing to say is that the number one cause of fatalities across the ICMM members is what the technical term for which is called vehicle interaction, basically people and trucks interacting and causing the death of people. About a quarter of all fatalities are caused by vehicle interactions. Then when you look deeper into, okay, what is actually happening, it seems to be that people are being hurt or killed when they're engaging in equipment that hasn't been properly shut down, or broken down equipment is being towed in a way that doesn't follow standard operating procedure, or you're having a situation where people are entering an active zone where vehicles are working that they shouldn't be entering. And that then, Helen, if you dissect why that is happening, it's coming back to the failure of critical controls. What we know is that there are critical controls that need to be followed that are not being followed, and as a result, these incidents are happening. Now, it's too easy in that situation, Helen, to blame the individual or to say that the control was lacking. What we're finding actually is that the next frontier we need to go to is a frontier where we are building a culture of care, where taking care of critical controls becomes second nature to people. We're not there yet. That is the next frontier of work that we have to take on. Geographically as well, and it's really interesting, for a long period of time, what we find is that the majority of incidents, about 90% of all fatalities, unfortunately occur underground. And then when you map that geographically, what you realize is that because of the very deep mines in parts of Africa, Africa typically contributes about half of all fatalities across the membership, even though it's only a quarter of all the hours worked. But last year, something changed. North America and Africa had the same number of fatalities. And so really, we now know we need to put even more focus on North America, while there's obviously the need for continued focus in sub-Saharan Africa, given the size of the fatalities there too. And the final thing I would just say, Helen, is that it doesn't just stop with physical safety. It starts with physical safety. If we cannot make sure that everybody goes home safe at the end of their shift, that is where we have to put all our efforts. But from there, it also needs to include a number of other factors relating to overall health. So, for example, we do a lot of work on minimizing the exposure that people have to diesel particulate emissions. So the stuff that comes out of the exhaust of a truck that's burning diesel. We've stepped up our efforts in that in the last 12 months, because really we should not be having people exposed to those emissions at all. And of course, it takes us into really difficult but super important topics like gender-based violence. And gender-based violence is unfortunately endemic both in our communities as well as in our workplaces around the world. And the industry, I'm proud to say, has been showing leadership across all sectors to root out gender-based violence. And that, just like we would not accept murder at our mine sites because it happens in society, we cannot simply say, oh yes, there's gender-based violence in our workplaces because there's gender-based violence in our communities. Well, let's change that then. Let's change our communities from a gender-based violence point of view. So that's the whole safety agenda, Helen. It starts with physical safety and reducing fatalities to zero, but it extends to overall health and well-being.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge topic and a huge challenge. And just as you were speaking there, it reminded me of two words that were quite prominent in the discourse when I was in industry, and that's critical controls, as you said, and psychological safety as a precursor to identifying where there are the physical hazards. But it sounds like you guys definitely have the right focus there. Maybe why don't we talk about another area that you mentioned, which was sort of harmonization, standardization. And you guys obviously have a huge number of members, which span many geographies. But I wonder how we, really continue to work towards a common language for the mining industry, particularly where I think in the last few years we're seeing some new actors coming into the space or becoming more dominant. And what I mean by this is over the last 5 to 10 years, I think we've seen an increasing presence of what we might call the non-traditional sources of finance and even project developers. So particularly from China and more recently the Middle East. How do you see these actors fitting into the sustainability standards that the ICMM is driving for?
Helen, let me say two things that are slightly controversial, but they're true, and I must say them. The first is that we as ICMM are very proud of the companies that belong to the group, but we are also not representative of the world. So we have one Chinese company that's a member, we have one Indian company, and one Saudi Arabian company. And so it is right, and I really, I'm very proud of the fact that we represent the large Anglo-Saxon Western miners. And that's just a reality we have to confront with, that there's a large portion of the world that we do not currently directly influence. And if we really care about making sure that the wider industry is fulfilling its obligations and responsibilities, then we have to engage that part of the world, which means approaching things with a slightly different mindset than we might have done in the past. The second thing I would say, Helen, that's a little controversial is that it's too easy for people to say Chinese companies have lower standards. That's the kind of easy trope that often people say, oh yes, we do things the right way in the West, and of course it's the Chinese or the Indians that have the worst standards. I can tell you this, Helen, that at the top level, so the Chinese counterparties to the ICMM members or the Indian counterparties to the ICMM members, there's virtually no difference in practices, standards, and commitments on sustainability. Yes, it is true that there is a much bigger middle and lower tier of mining companies in China that do not follow the right standards and have caused harm when they've operated both in China and outside. But that would be true for every other country too. It's simply that the numbers are much bigger in China, therefore it tends to show up in a much bigger way. So Alan, with those kind of just checking at least my own biases, the fact is that globally there are in the order of 16,000 mines that we have mapped. So we've mapped every mine and smelter we can, and geotagged it locationally to what commodity it produces, primary and secondary commodities, where it's located. Now, we know that now. And as I said, ICMM accounts for under 1,000 of those mines. So there are 15,000 mines globally that may or may not be following any standard of responsible mining. And that's a problem. Now, one of the reasons that is the case, in addition to maybe the commitment of those operators, is that there has so far not been a standard that anybody could pick up and use. You had to be a member of ICMM or a part of the World Gold Council in order to embrace those voluntary principles. Now, that's not an efficient system. It just means that there are so many people out there that might want to do the right thing, but don't have a way to do it. The other issue was that some of the standards were developed just for really advanced operators. And so if you weren't already, a multi-billion-dollar company with lots of resources to follow the many, many checklists to show that you're being responsible, there was nothing there for you. So to fix all those challenges, Helen, we've been on a 4-year journey, and we're now 6 months away from the finalization of it, to produce a consolidated global standard for responsible mining. This brings together the best of 4 standards. It's the ICMM's standard, the World Gold Council's principles, the Mining Association of Canada's protocol, and Coppermark. And by combining those 4, you're setting a really high bar, but you're also giving a very clear ladder that any company can climb, no matter what their starting point is, to demonstrate that they're being responsible. And so this should eliminate any excuses or barriers that people may have to embrace responsible mining practices. And of course, what we're working hard to do, Helen, and this is where BMO and a number of your clients are immensely helpful, is to make sure that investors then embrace it and can value companies on the basis of whether or not they're implementing these mechanisms. Customers are starting to now require companies to do this in order to supply them, like the car makers or the big tech companies. And governments are starting to recognize that if you are applying one of these standards, then your permitting process can be a lot shorter and more streamlined, because you don't have to repeat and show that you're doing certain things that the standard already requires you to do. So, Helen, I don't want to tempt fate here, but I would say that by the middle of this year, we should have this standard up and running. And I genuinely believe it will be a game changer for how the industry acts, and how easy it is for anybody to embrace responsible practices.
Yeah, I mean, I've got to say, like, that is quite an achievement. I mean, this consolidated global standards that you've been working towards, I mean, that to me seems like a key step to lower those barriers to standardization. So I look forward to seeing the further updates on that. Now, Ro, I want to shift over to a slightly different topic now, which is geopolitics. Very much at the front of headlines at the moment as well. Now, a lot is changing in mining, and of course, a lot is changing in the world around us. And in past conversations that you've had with BMO, you and others have talked about the inertia in the mining industry. And not just that, but perhaps society's attitude towards mining, so inertia in that. But things are moving very quickly now in geopolitics, and that in turn is directly impacting mining. So a couple of specific examples. The last 6 months, we've seen a level of government interest in critical minerals and mining step up to a level that we haven't seen, frankly, in decades. So we've had plenty of developments on the policy front, like Section 232 tariff investigations. Indeed, we have had tariffs applied to some metals. We've had stockpiling in the US and even direct government investment in mining projects. I think there was an announcement out over the weekend about another one in rare earths. So this has been a huge theme in our world, in the investment world. So we've gone from very slow speed to very quick speed. Are things moving too quickly now, in your view, Ro? Or is this change actually very welcome?
The change is very welcome, Helen, and there is a risk that it overheats, which we should guard against. But we have 2, 3, 4 decades of catch up to play at a time when governments writ large had basically checked out of the sector. It really wasn't a priority, and so there was very little support coming from governments to make sure that projects get done, that hurdles are cleared, that there is support for mining in the right way, of course. Nobody's suggesting that this would be done by running roughshod over the rights of people or the environment. Absolutely not. And everything we've talked about earlier confirms just how committed the industry is to doing it the right way. But still, you do need the public authorities to pave the way for mining projects to happen, because they can't be built by companies alone. They require so much to happen for a mining project to be successful. Can we take a specific example, Helen? Because I think when we dive into a specific situation, it may help people see where we are and what some of the tension points really are. And so I think the example that's most interesting to look at is Argentina. Now, Argentina, under the current Milei administration, has a framework or a scheme called RIGI, R-I-G-I. I'm not even going to try and pronounce that in Spanish. Essentially, what it's designed to do is to provide 2 avenues to attract inward investment into Argentina's mining industry. And we know that Argentina, much like many of the other countries in that Andean region, is extremely rich in critical minerals, particularly in copper. And so this RIGI scheme allows companies to invest in projects and gain a level of policy certainty, sometimes up to 40 years, and a number of other incentives to make your investment more attractive. And this has had a really positive impact in significant investments coming into particularly the copper industry in Argentina. And you're starting to see the Vicuña complex in Argentina become one of the most important copper-related discoveries in modern times. I would say that is to copper what something like Western Australian iron ore is to iron ore. I mean, that's how significant this can be. So under the RIGI scheme, we're seeing companies being attracted to invest in the country with the level of policy certainty, support, and fast tracking of permitting that the industry has long been calling for. And that's a really positive thing. Now, to your point, is it going too far, too fast? Now, here, a current issue is playing out that highlights this tension, because RIGI does not override federal laws, especially when federal laws in Argentina relate to the protection of glaciers. Now, glaciers exist in the high Andean mountains where copper mining is taking place, and there's a 2010 law in Argentina to protect those glaciers from development, particularly from mining. And essentially what it allows is for a blanket ban on mining in certain regions where there are glaciers present. And so there's a real tension right now. RIGI is promoting more mining and the glacier law is putting a stop against mining in certain jurisdictions. Now, the Milley administration is currently pushing through an amendment to that 2010 glacier law, which would redefine and would reorient what counts as a glacier rather than in any way rolling back the glacier protection significantly. It's simply saying that there are some things classified as glaciers that shouldn't be classified as glaciers because they don't actually contain that much ice content. Of course, people who don't want to see this amendment would say, but hang on, they still are very important for water table balance, and we need to be really careful about that. So this debate's playing out now. But Helen, I say all of this to say that even in governments like Argentina, where there's fast tracking of permitting, there are laws and provisions like the glacier law that to design to make sure it doesn't go too far. And through the natural, messy process of democracy and working through these challenges, we will land at a place that can ensure sufficient protection for people and the environment while supporting mining projects. So that's, to me, is Argentina's ground zero for this real debate about how to fast track permitting, but not also abandon the safeguards for people and the environment.
I mean, that's a great example. I think it really brings it alive, and it's such a fine balance, isn't it, when it comes to environmental protection, but also economic progress and creating jobs and opportunities. But definitely, watch this space in Argentina anyway, in the Vicuña region. That sounds quite fast moving there. Maybe just like staying on this topic a little bit more, and given changes happening at a real pace now, this sudden surge in investment, not just from government, but also the private sector as well, and seeing a lot of M&A again. With though this fast, potentially fast tracking of permits, mining permits in some parts of the world that we're seeing. We've got obviously the new tensions between the world's powerful nations. How can we make sure that sustainability is not forgotten in all of this? I mean, of course, I hope it's not, but do you think that sustainability is still getting the right amount of focus time in boardrooms? So the mining companies' boardrooms, given that we have all these new forces coming together and changing priorities. So how do you see this, Ro? And what is your message to mining companies and investors to make sure that the focus on sustainability isn't lost?
Helen, what I'm about to say might mean that you never invite me back, and that's fine if it's the case, because I really am speaking from my heart here, which is that for a long time, and particularly now, there has been almost no investor support or interest in sustainability, at least when it comes to the companies in ICMM. Every CEO I talk to gives me the same message, which is that investors don't ask questions. They don't really value the efforts that are being made on sustainability, and they don't really seem to encourage or support companies to embed those sustainability principles into the way they run their businesses. Now, you might say, well, actually, no, it's the ESG engagement folk that are still pushing the agenda at a technical level, and that's okay. But look, if the portfolio manager is not really that concerned about sustainability, and they're not raising it with the CEO whenever they're sitting down and talking about the key issues, it's asking a heck of a lot of companies to keep doing that, especially when there are some real dollars and cents behind it, if the investment community isn't going to demonstrate that it values it and it recognizes it. Now, I'm not in any way suggesting, Helen, that this should be done in a way that is not business positive. And that's a version of sustainability that none of us would subscribe to or believe in. The fact is that when you do something that is to make your operations more responsible, you're also making them more resilient. You're also making them more productive. And so we really, it is my job and the industry job to demonstrate more clearly the connection between sustainability initiatives and business value. And I don't, bemoan investors for maybe not recognizing that, because perhaps we haven't told that story as well as we should. At the same time, I really do think that investors can be more proactive in also seeking out the logic and the commitment of companies to doing business the right way. Now, Helen, where I think things stand right now, in the last 12 months, I think, and I say this as a fully committed person to sustainability, I think the correction we have seen in sustainability was much needed. It had become toppy and frothy. I mean, it had lost all connection to business value because people were so obsessed with the new fad or the new trend, or wanting to virtue signal and wanting to show that they were really good forgetting that the real logic for sustainability has always been to make businesses more resilient and more productive by making societies more resilient and safer and more sustainable. And so I think it's a welcome thing that we have had to really look hard at which aspects of sustainability drive business value and which don't. But what I can tell you, Helen, is that it has not changed in the boardroom of the 26 companies at ICMM. It is still a priority as much as it was before, because the reason companies committed to this in the first place was not to look good, was not to have good PR. It was to do the right thing, because the right thing for society is often the right thing for their businesses. What I do worry, though, Helen, my big worry, though, is that as we look to the future, the mines that are being commissioned and built now, I'm not sure that responsibility and sustainability is being given as much consideration, because there is more of a pressure to get the supply on stream. And, I think of a mine like Quellaveco, which is a mine operated by Anglo American in Peru. It's got a fascinating history, because Anglo Americans spent an extra, 12 to 18 months engaging with the community, more than they needed to, just to build a level of consensus around the mine, so that they didn't have a situation of people being unhappy with the mine once it was up and running. Now, that was built in the early 2010s. At the time, the environment was different. Today, could I imagine a company being given the support to spend an extra 12, 18 months engaging communities to build broad-based support? I don't think so, because I think there would just be so much pressure to dig, baby, dig, that you might think that actually this is a luxury that you don't need to worry about. But of course, we know that if you don't do things right at the beginning, there are going to be problems down the line. So it's absolutely still a priority. I do worry about new projects, and I really hope that investors can reinforce the connection between sustainability and business value in a way that supports what the companies themselves are trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the nub of the issue, really, is moving fast, but not forgetting the things that relate to sustainability. And I think you framed it in a really good way, is like making investors see the link between sustainability, resilience of the operations, and performance, and hence value. And perhaps that got lost, in the last few years, but it's good to see that conversation changing. Now, finally, we've had a great conversation. I feel like we could talk for hours, Ro, but one thing I've been wondering a little bit is, with this new interest from governments in the mining space, and obviously it's bringing lots of money into the space, but are we missing other opportunities where, we've got government coming together with the private sector that we haven't really been talking about yet? So have you got any early thoughts about new opportunities that could arise, mainly in the sustainability space, that could open up now as a result of this new, pickup in government interest?
Absolutely, Helen. It's as I said, it's so welcome to see governments being as proactive as they are in the sector now. And I think the potential to use that for better collaboration is massive. Let me just give you one example. What we see around the world is that around the same ore body, you have mines that essentially have been permitted, designed, and operated entirely separately, thus requiring two sets of infrastructure, two sets of community engagement plans, two sets of tailings facilities, two sets of everything, with the result being that the impact that we are having on the society and on environment is so much greater than it needs to be if we were to be better at working together. And I'm so pleased that in the last couple of years, we have seen examples of what I suppose, one would technically call adjacencies between two mines, but really what it means is sharing. And so I think the first best example was probably Los Bronces and Andina, two copper mines on either side, really just meters apart from each other in Chile. And I've stood on the Los Bronces side, and I can see into Andina. So it makes no sense that the two mines would have been operating as separately as they were. And of course, Codelco and Anglo American have come together to build a joint mine plan. Now, this is where governments come in, because, of course, to build a joint mine plan means changing the way that it was permitted, means changing how it was incentivized, changing how it's managed from a public regulatory point of view. So I really hope governments can see this and then support more of that joint work, because it has business value it increases supply, and of course, it has sustainability benefits. Of course, this adjacencies is also a big reason for the logic between of the merger between Anglo and Teck, because of Collahuasi and QB2 being and very similarly located. But now, Helen, you look around the world, you look at the Platinum District in South Africa, there should be so much collaboration happening there in terms of adjacencies. The mines in the Peruvian Andes are also similarly co-located. There is so much sharing and collaboration we could be doing that has, as I say, business value, government value, and societal value benefits. And then, Helen, the last thing I would say is that governments can really help incentivize companies to do the right thing. Because if you give credit essentially to companies who are applying good standards of responsible mining by speeding up their permitting, what you're then doing is incentivizing other people to do the right thing as well. Now, in the EU, if you are following one of the accredited voluntary standards or standards that meet a certain level of credibility, then in the EU, you'll get your mining permit within 36 months, which is, of course, a massive cut down from how long it currently takes. So that's really positive. Again, governments showing a willingness to step in and help the sector beyond, even if you don't have the same resources as the US to put money into companies, there are other things that governments can be doing to help the sector. So I'm cautiously very optimistic, Helen, that in the last 12 to 24 months, the momentum we've seen behind the sector is translating into real support. And I think this marks the start of a new era of growth and development in the mining industry, which sets us up, I think, for a 10, 20-year unprecedented period of growth in what I hope will be responsibly mined critical minerals.
Wow, Ro, that really was quite an optimistic way to start to bring our podcast to a close. And I have to say, you made a really good point there about adjacencies and sharing and bringing these mines together that are so geographically closely located, and then minimizing the overall land and environmental footprint. And I have to say, it's an angle that I hadn't quite considered before. And of course, synergies, that is a very big driver of the current wave of M&A that we're seeing in the space at the moment. So, Ro, before we close out our conversation here, I want to give you the opportunity just to sum up in a few thoughts or give us your parting words, what you would really like listeners to be left with.
I've been thinking a lot recently about trying to make sense of this moment. And I think I sum it up in one very simple thought, which is that the world needs more mining and it demands better mining. That's our mantra for the future, because I think there is now universal acceptance that without more mining, we cannot have AI, defense, the energy transition, roads, buildings, infrastructure, anything. Modern life requires more mining. Generally, I think people understand that. What we need to hear as the industry is the demand from society for better mining, to ensure that mining in the future is done in a different way to what people remember it to have been decades in the past. And I just really hope we can have a level of humility and understanding around why people have that concern before we jump into telling people why they're wrong to think the way they do about mining, or vice versa. Just to give people the confidence that although the minerals we mine are critical, we will produce them as if they were not. Because you see, to us, when we say critical minerals, we know what it means. But to other people, they might think, that means you're willing to do anything to get them. And so really my hope, and I guess my commitment and promise from ICMM, is that we believe in mining with principles, that because of what we produce being so critical to the world, we must produce it with the greatest care.
Amazing, Ro. I think, such powerful final words to leave us with. The world needs more and better mining. So, Ro, this has, as always, been a fascinating and inspiring conversation. And your passion and drive to keep pushing the industry towards positive change is valued by so many of us in the industry, but society as a whole. So thank you again, Ro, for joining us in this podcast and also at our upcoming mining conference.
Thanks so much, Helen. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. You can follow this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. For more episodes, visit bmocm.com/marketsplus.
The views expressed here are those of the participants and may not necessarily represent those of BMO Capital Markets, its affiliates, or subsidiaries.
For BMO disclosures, please visit bmocm.com/podcast/disclaimer.